Well, welcome everyone to the sixth section of Lawyers as Leaders. And our guest today is Professor and Dean Rosa Brooks. Welcome and thank you very much for being our guest lecturer.
Glad to be here, Bill.
So before I do my introduction, a few housekeeping items. First of all, I'd like to say how much I appreciate so many of you taking the survey we sent out. It's very helpful to have your feedback about the course. A word on the questions you submit, which many of you wrote about. The questions serve multiple purposes. The first is that they help you engage with the reading and think critically about it. The second is they help us prepare for the session. It gives me an understanding about what's on your mind. And we can't address all of the questions, but the TAs and I work hard to get at the gist of many of them. And then we also take questions during the course of each session. So the questions are they're really invaluable and make this course run. So finally, I'd like to recognize Johanna Moody, the TA who helped organize today's session and who did a fabulous job. So thank you very much, Johanna. And I'd like to thank again Dean Sale, who helped us think through this session. So now our introduction. Professor Brooks is the Associate Dean for Centers and Institutes at the Law Center and the Scott Ginsberg Professor of Law and Policy. After graduating from Harvard University, Professor Brooks went on to earn her master's degree in social anthropology from Oxford and her JD from Yale Law School. Before joining the Georgetown Law faculty in 2007, she was a faculty member at the University of Virginia Law School. In addition to her many years in academia, Professor Brooks has led an extraordinarily fruitful career focused on issues related to human rights, foreign policy, and most recently, police reform. Professor Brooks focused on human rights issues in her capacity as special counsel to the Open Society Foundation, an international grant-making organization that supports independent groups working on issues related to justice, democratic governance, and human rights. Professor Brooks also served as the director of Yale Law School's Human Rights Program, as a consultant for Human Rights Watch, and as a board member for Amnesty International USA. Professor Brooks advanced the field of foreign policy in her capacity as a senior advisor to the U.S. Department of State during the Clinton administration, as an executive member of the American Society of International Law, as counselor to Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Michelle Flournoy, and as special coordinator for rule of law and humanitarian policy in the Pentagon from 2009 to 2011, among other notable positions. In July 2011, she received the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service. She's also been an advocate for police reform and currently serves as a leader on Georgetown Law's innovative policing program. Professor Brooks has published seminal books, including her 2016 book, which is called How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything, which the New York Times listed as a notable book of the year. And she has a forthcoming book on policing in America, which is entitled Tangled Up in Blue, Policing in 21st Century America. Most recently, and the topic of our session today, Professor Brooks co-founded the Transition Integrity Project, the findings of which were a key component of our readings today and which have received attention from multiple national and state publications. We're fortunate to have Professor Brooks here with us today to share her insights during this critical moment we're in. So before we get to talking about the Transition Integrity Project, let's start with some biography. So Professor Brooks, your professional and academic background is quite diverse in focus. Are there any social or political issues that you feel most passionate about that tend to drive your work?
It's a good question, and it's a hard question, Bill, and it's a question I'm always asking myself. I think that, and I have a feeling others have probably said the same thing to the students in this group, that careers make sense only in hindsight. You know, that the narrative is constructed in hindsight. You don't quite know what you're doing until you look back and you say, hey, wait a minute, there is a pattern there. And I think for me, the pattern has been a fascination with the relationship between law and norms, and in particular, the ways in which law and norms attempt to regulate and manage violence give meaning to violence, channel violence, constrain violence, not necessarily reduce violence, but give it meaning. So I think that's the sort of cluster of issues, whether I was early in my career working on human rights issues and looking at travesties like the atrocities committed by the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, or the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, or whether it's the work that I've done more recently on the military and how the US makes sense of things like drone strikes, or more recently still the work I've been doing on policing. And as you know, I in a fit of slightly demented immersion journalism, I actually became a reserve police officer in Washington, D.C., and I've been one for the last 4.5 years because I was fascinated. I'm always fascinated by when things don't work, when people are saying, hey, look, the police are brutal, or look at police killings, or this terrible thing is happening. I'm always fascinated, whether it's that or the atrocities of the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. I'm fascinated by the stories people tell themselves about violence and why they think it makes sense, when it makes sense, what role the law can have in changing how people make sense of violence, what are the limits of law. So I guess that's the set of intellectual issues and moral issues that tend to fascinate me.
And how did you come to get interested in those
I
issues?
don't know. I'm not quite sure. I grew up in a family of left-wing activists. Some of my earliest memories are as a little toddler being taken off to march against the Vietnam War, and then for me, my young adulthood was in a very different moment. My early childhood was at a moment where the American left was very critical of the US military and military force. But my own young adulthood was during this brief period after the fall of the Soviet Union, when it looked like there was going to be a new world order, when the US military was intervening at times to stop genocides, or not in the case of Rwanda. And I think for me, it forced me to really think very hard about just again, these stories we tell ourselves about violence, law, when is violence necessary, when is violence good, when is violence bad, what is the role of the law and all of that. But I don't know, it's a hard question to answer, and I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question.
And then, and you've written on the military, war, policing most recently. And how has that informed your view of law and government institutions? So, from your scholarship to really the kind of the backdrop to what you're focusing on
Well,
now.
I think a lot of my work, both my scholarly work and my interests, were very much informed by the time I spent studying anthropology. And of course, if lawyers learn about law as rules and procedures, anthropologists learn about law as rituals and traditions. And I think that now I've forgotten your question, actually. But I think that for me, that was very powerful. That really, it from the very beginning. And I studied anthropology before I went to law school. And while I was in law school, I continued to take some graduate seminars in the anthropology department. So just that sort of fascination with thinking about thinking about the very different ways in which people think about law, and my own take on law is that law does not exist outside of politics. I suppose you could just say maybe that just means I'm a legal realist, and so is everybody else. But whenever I hear somebody say, "Oh, but that can't happen because it's against the law," my immediate thought is, well, that depends. The rule of law exists when people believe in the rule of law. Law is effective when people believe law is effective. Law is effective when people choose to make it effective. And to give an extremely simplistic example, most of us, probably the fact that most of the people in this Zoom room are in law school in the first place, if you get to an intersection and you're at the intersection and there's a red light or there's a stoplight and there are no other cars, you can't see anything for miles, there are no police cars, you probably still stop at that red light and wait for it to turn green. Why do you do that? You don't have to, there's no safety issue, you're not going to get caught. Well, we do it because we have a collective belief that it matters that we follow these rules, that there's something important about it, that transcends its sort of immediate utility. And we're lucky that we mostly, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about the transition election, the integrity project, we mostly live in a society in which most people, almost all people, to sort of paraphrase the late Lou Henkin, who said this about international law, he said, almost all states abide by almost all their international obligations almost all the time. And you could say that about law in general, right? You could say that we're very lucky because we live in a society in which almost all people abide by almost all of their legal obligations almost all of the time, not because there's a police officer standing over them waiting to arrest them if they break the law, but because we believe that we should. We think it matters. We think, but that's not because there is a coercive power that makes us do it. That's not because there is a police officer at every corner checking up on us. In some cases there are, but mostly there's not, right? That most of us obey the law because we think it's a good thing to do. And we don't need someone to force us to. We just think society works better. We're willing to make these collective sacrifices to do things that are inconvenient for ourselves, and sometimes are destructive to our own personal economic interests or whatever, because we think law matters. But that's a commitment, that's a cultural commitment. That's not about coercion. That's not about law having some independent force. That's about a set of beliefs that we have. It's about a culture that we have. So I think that very much informs my view of law in general, is that, law works, law looks like law when it is, to use the phrase of the late anthropologist Paul Bohannon, it's double institutionalized norms. It's norms that we have that then get turned into this sort of second set of, written codes with a set of processes that can back them up. And if you don't have that, it doesn't work.
So, and actually I have to say, I like the example of the stoplight. When there are no police around, there's nobody around. It's actually, in some sense, it's a waste of your time to stop at the stoplight.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, it's instilled in us to wait for the light to change. So it's not about the punishment. It's not about what's efficient. It's about what's ingrained.
Yeah. And that could break down. And, in the first part of my career, pre having children, when I was traveling all over the world, doing human rights work, I worked in a lot of societies where nobody ever stopped at stoplights unless there was a army vehicle or police vehicle there, where those norms had completely broken down, and in every way, not just the norms about the stoplights, but the norms about almost everything. I worked and lived in societies in which the social fabric had decayed to the extent that people basically, ordinary, good, decent people said, you just you can't afford to stop at that stoplight because carjackers might show up, or you can't afford to be generous to that person who asks you for help, because then you'll be vulnerable to the next person and then you'll have nothing, et cetera, et cetera. And it's those norms are actually, I think, far more fragile than we often think. And working and living in places where they had broken down utterly, sometimes to the point of mass atrocities and genocides, I think it's a very, obviously a painful, shocking, and incredibly powerful reminder of how much those norms matter and how bad things get and how fast they get bad when that set of norms breaks down.
And can they be reestablished?
They can be, but it's a lot harder to wreck them than to fix them. There was a World Bank report, I think from 2009, that attempted to look at cross-culturally at societies that had sort of scored very poorly on the sort of normal indexes of democracy, rule of law, anti-corruption, you name it, and how long it took them on average to go from kind of being basket case societies to functional societies. And I can't remember the exact number. Somebody should look this up. It was a 2009 World Bank report on poverty. But for rule of law, it said that the average time to go from no rule of law to basically being a rule of law society was something like 47 years. You know, and this is one of the great tragedies, and social psychologists write about that. You know, when you think about whether you think about things like the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide or the civil war in the former Yugoslavia, things can fall apart really fast. You know, it takes a year or two or less for things to fall apart, even in societies that seem pretty healthy. And then it's the work of a generation or more to fix them again. So yes, you can fix them again. You know, Germany today and Germany in 1939 or 1943 are radically different places. Japan today and Japan during the Second World War are radically different cultures. But it took a lot of time.
So, is this, your background in studying norms and rules, is that part of what led you to look at election law and kind of where we are now?
It's funny. I don't know anything about election law. I know more now than I knew a year ago, but I'm not an election law expert by any stretch of the imagination. The origin of the Transition Integrity Project, which is not, by the way, an organization, it's just a series of exercises. Actually, I'll tell you this story, Bill. It came out of, it started at a dinner in your honor. Remember a little over a year ago, there was a dinner in your honor, I think on the occasion of your receipt of a chair. And you got the dean chair or whatever. I forget what it's called, but it was a very fancy title, and there was a very nice banquet for you before the pandemic, of course, in the atrium in Hotong. And there were a couple hundred people. Everybody was celebrating, and people were making speeches about how great you are, and it was a lot of fun. And all kinds of people who had known you over the years were there. And I was sitting at a table next to a federal appellate court judge and a bunch of fancy lawyers. And I won't mention the name of the federal appellate court judge, but it's someone you know. And we started chatting about Donald Trump, which of course is something that happens in Washington, right? He was like, "Oh, can you believe what Trump just did?" And I said, kind of idly, I said, "Gosh, Trump, he is such a norm breaker. Can you imagine, what if he loses the election next year and he won't leave? What if he just sort of says, 'No, I didn't lose. It was fake news. It was a coup, whatever. I'm staying.'" And the federal appellate court judge laughed and sort of gave, I don't remember if she actually patted me on the shoulder, but she sort of did the equivalent. She sort of, "Oh, don't be so silly. That's never going to happen. The military would never let that happen." And one of the other people sitting at the table, also known to you, but I'll let him be anonymous, laughed and said, "Oh, that's not going to happen. The Secret Service would never let that happen." And the conversation moved on. But it kind of stayed with me, and I was thinking, because of course the issue is not actually what if Trump loses and he goes, "Oh, gee, I lost, but I won't leave." That's not going to happen, right? The situation when you have someone who is willing to break norms, is willing to say, "Wait, why should I stop at that stoplight when there's nobody there? That makes no sense," right? When you have a president who seems to think like that very often, the dangerous situation is one of uncertainty and ambiguity. The dangerous situation is, well, what if it's really close? What if it's not quite clear? What if there are allegations that the mail-in ballots that seem to shift things to the Democratic candidate were fraudulent? And there is space, there's rhetorical space, there's political space to say, "I didn't lose. I did win. it is fake news that I lost. I am the legitimate president and I'm not leaving. And I was thinking about these claims that, like the military wouldn't let that happen. And I thought that doesn't make any sense on any level, or the Secret Service. I mean, well, first of all, if it takes the military to save American democracy, then there's not a whole lot worth saving. But even beyond that, just thinking about institutions, and again, coming at this from the perspective of someone with a background in anthropology, I thought that's a view of institutions and laws that to me seems naive. It's a view of institutions and laws as existing sort of outside of politics. And people sometimes use this metaphor about the guardrails of democracy, and they talk about them as if there are these literal sort of metal guardrails that pop up at the appropriate moment. If you're on the roller coaster of democracy and oops, suddenly you're in a perilous part. So boing, the guardrails spring up and you're fine. And they're mechanical and you don't have to do anything about it. And that institutions, the military, the Secret Service sort of function that way. And I thought that doesn't make sense to me. The military is made up of people. The Secret Service is made up of people. Every institution we have, they're not outside of politics. They're not mechanical. They're made up of human beings. And in a situation where there was ambiguity, let's say you're in the Secret Service, and let's say hypothetically something that could happen in a week and a couple of days, right? Let's say we do have election day results favor Trump, the in-person votes, so at 2 a.m. on election day, the precincts reporting in, it appears that Trump is ahead and is likely to win. And then there are X million uncounted mail-in ballots. And the Trump campaign says, we think those are fraudulent. We think they were whatever, cast by dead people, cast by illegal aliens. They were, manipulated. The Russians did it, Chinese did it, Hunter Biden did it, whatever. So they shouldn't be counted. And then there's a big fight, and there's a legal fight, there's a political fight, and there's a sort of narrative battle in the social media and so on. And there you are, you're the head of the Secret Service or whatever. And you're thinking to yourself, gee, I think Biden actually won. I don't think those ballots were fraudulent, but your boss, the head of Homeland Security, who I'm not sure we actually have one right now, but we have an acting one, right? Who works for President Trump, says, no, they're fraudulent. Trump really won. And Trump says, I really won. And Attorney General Barr says, yeah, Trump totally won, absolutely won. Who's going to be the guy or the woman, right? Who says, no, I'm escorting Trump out of the Oval Office because Biden's going to be the real president. It's impossible to imagine, to me at least. It's impossible to imagine that happening. Because everything we know about things when norms break down is that people, especially on the spur of the moment, when they're confronted with chaotic, rapidly changing situations, people don't want to stick their necks out. People kind of look around and they go, oh, what's my colleague doing? What's my boss doing? And the safer thing is to do what your boss says. So I've been thinking about all of this. And then the rest of this story, this is actually a rather sad story, depending on your point of view, Bill. All of this is kind of going back and forth in my mind. And as I was just kind of dwelling on this and thinking about that conversation and thinking, gosh, how I wish there was some way. And these are sophisticated people saying things like, oh, the military will never let that happen. And these are not dummies. These are people who are really smart and thoughtful about the law and so on. And I was thinking, boy, you almost want to kind of choose your own adventure novel. I don't know if the people in the audience are maybe too young to remember these, but these are these children's books where you'd get to, on page 10 it would say, if you decide to take the path into the dark jungle, turn to page 37. If you choose to stay in the middle of the open meadow hoping that it will be safer, turn to page 52. And you decide to go into the dark jungle, and on page 37 goes, oops, you were eaten by a tiger, the end. And you have multiple sort of branching pathways. And I was sort of thinking, you almost want to kind of push people through these branching pathways of like, what if this? Yes, well, what if you made that decision? Well, what would happen then? What if you made that decision? What would this actor do then? And then I got a phone call out of the blue from a guy named Nils Gilman, who I knew slightly. He's a historian who used to be at Berkeley and is now at a foundation in California. And he said one of those things that, you know, academics, it's like a dream phone call. He said, Rosa, I love your work. I want to fund you. You know, we have money. I want to give you money to work on whatever you want to work on because I just love your work. And I'm thinking like, wow, this is the most amazing phone call I've ever had. This is so cool. But I had just finished a book. I just finished this book on policing. I didn't really have a project. And I said, well, you know, Nils, the thing I've been kind of just, this is that maybe is a little bit crazy, but I've been thinking about this whole cluster of issues about the what ifs, you know, what if we had an electoral outcome and it was contested, and you know what would actually happen, and I feel like we should do some kind of choose your adventure or some kind of, you know, wargaming type exercises to try to simulate you know, the what ifs, what could actually happen, to figure out, are those guardrails of democracy strong enough, or are they not? And he said, I love that idea. That's so wonderful. What a great idea. I want to fund that. That's so great. Let me just go talk to my boss at the foundation. And this is so great. Let's do this. And so a couple of days later, he calls me back and he says, oh, I've got really bad news. My boss doesn't want to do this. My boss thinks this is too political and too controversial, and he doesn't want to fund it. But I really like the idea. So I think we should do it together. So I went in the course of a week to, you know, let me throw money at you to do whatever you want, to hey, here's this unfunded project that we should work on together, and let's just work on this massive, complicated, unfunded project together. And that was the beginning of the project. That's a slightly sad story.
But you were able to go ahead with it.
Yeah, no, I said, yeah, let's do, because it didn't actually seem like it would cost that much money, you know, and it didn't. And in fact, the pandemic intervened and made it even cheaper, because instead of having to get money to fly people somewhere and sit in a room together, we ended up doing it all by Zoom. So in fact, it was very cheap. But what we did, we started by doing a lot of kind of one-on-one consultations with both Democrats and Republicans, saying, is this worth doing? You know, is it worth doing this kind of exercise? Is there a value in this? And we got a certain number of people saying, like, you know, the equivalent of what had happened at that dinner of like, oh, ho, ho, it's so cute that you're so paranoid, but, you know, that's silly. What a waste of time. You know, everything's fine, and this is just alarmist. And but we got enough people, including, you know, we made a very conscious effort to reach out to both Republicans and Democrats. And we got enough people on sort of both sides of the political aisle that said, yeah, you know, I'm worried about this too, and that probably is worthwhile. So we raised just enough money to hire a project manager and to hire an expert in designing exercises like this, war games. And we put them together, and in June of 2020, we did 4 exercises.
So, and how were these modeled on things that you did at the Defense Department?
To some extent. I mean, call them war games makes them sound very bellicose, right? But these are things that, you know, corporations do, nonprofits do, educational institutions do. And the thing about this kind of simulation is that they're a way to explore what ifs. They're a way to explore worst case scenarios. And frankly, they're a way to force people to confront their own assumptions and biases. And to give a military example, right? And I'm just making this up, by the way, this is not draw on any actual classified information, or in fact, any information whatsoever. I'm just, you know, like, let's say, you know, you are the Secretary of Defense, and you say, we could totally take North Korea. I don't care about their nuclear weapons. They're no threat to us. That might be right. You know, on the other hand, it might be wrong. And the purpose of doing a war game on North Korea and their nuclear capabilities is to say, are we right about that or are we wrong? You know, that so you do a war game and you assign people to play the North Koreans and you assign people to play the Chinese and you assign people to play the Russians and you assign people, you know, to play the various US actors, and you say, you know, you maybe try several different scenarios, you know, one of which you start with North Korea, you know, launches a nuclear weapon, you know, that actually does hit a US target. And then you say, okay, now what are you going to do? Now what are you going to do? Now what are you going to do? Now what do the North Koreans do? Now what do the Chinese do? Now what are the Russians doing in the meantime? What are the Iranians doing while you're busy doing that, et cetera, et cetera. And you work through that. And maybe you work through multiple scenarios. And maybe what you learn is really reassuring. Maybe what you learn is you go, we absolutely have the capabilities to handle this. You know, it would be bad and scary, but we could handle it. Or maybe you go, uh-oh, you know, there are some real gaps in our capabilities. And if that happened, we would be in big trouble. And the reason you do these exercises is not just to scare yourself, it's to say, it looks like we need to shore up our capabilities over here. Or it looks like we need to do some hard diplomatic work over here with the Chinese to make sure that the North Koreans don't do that. And what these games are not is predictions, right? You're not doing these games because you think, oh, the North Koreans are going to do this. You're doing these games to, as I say, it's a way of exploring what ifs, and it's a way of exploring your own assumptions, you know, that it's a way of saying, don't just sit there and say to yourself, I'm sure everything will be fine, but to say, yeah, but what if this bad thing happened, even if that bad thing is quite unlikely, you know, would you be able to cope with that bad thing? And if the answer to that is no, then even if that bad thing is pretty unlikely, you might want to shore up your defenses. You know, I mean, or to use a more familiar metaphor for most of us, you know, if you're thinking, gee, my house could never be burglarized, you know, you might do a simulation where you try to, you know, work with people who pretend to be burglars and try to figure out if they can get into your house. And maybe they say, hey, guess what? You forgot all about that basement window because we got in really easily and you didn't even notice while we took away your safe full of priceless heirlooms. And you go, oh, I guess I should put bars on that window. And that's not because you think you're going to be burglarized. It's just because you think we just identified a risk that could be mitigated. And maybe it's a 1 in 3 risk, maybe it's a 1 in 1,000 risk, but it doesn't cost that much to put the bars on the window. So let's do it. And that's the purpose of exercises like these. And I should also say they're completely artificial and constrained in a million ways. You know, you've got people are playing roles. It's not real. You've got these arbitrary rules about time limits and how many moves players can make per round and what constitutes a move and how do you assess the probability of success of their moves. You know, so they're not real, but I think they can often produce some really useful insights in terms of what you're prepared for, what you're not prepared for, and what you could maybe do to be more prepared.
So let me ask 2 questions that came in from students in the class. One is, if positions were flipped and Donald Trump were a Democrat, would you have been so motivated to do all this work?
It's a fair question. It's a fair question, but I think the answer is yes. And I think that's the reason. And we had as many Republican participants as Democratic participants, because I think, you know, and there may be people in the audience who disagree with this, but I think that President Trump has been a norm breaker like no other president, certainly in my memory. He's been willing to ignore norms, you know, maybe sometimes ignore norms that are stupid norms, but often to ignore norms that I think are really important norms for democracy. And I think that's the reason that we had so many Republican participants. You know, we had participants from the GOP side who'd been, you know, the head of the Republican National Committee, who'd been Republican secretaries of state at the state level, who'd been senior campaign staff on every recent Republican presidential campaign, for instance. So I don't think any of us really saw this as about Democratic Party versus Republican Party. I think the people who participated in these exercises very much saw this as, this is a group of people who has a shared commitment to saying, we have a set of political norms in this country that we think are valuable and that we think are pro-democracy and pro-tolerance and pro-openness to healthy kinds of change. And we want to keep them. And we are concerned that those norms are in jeopardy. So in that sense, I think the answer is yes. I don't think it's about partisanship. I mean, we had a few critics on the right say, well, how come you didn't include anybody, who was pro-Trump in the exercises? To which the only real possible answer to that is we weren't doing the exercises for Trump. We were doing the exercises for people who were concerned about Trump. If you're trying to figure out whether how prepared you are to deal with the North Korean nuclear threat, you don't invite the North Koreans to participate in your exercise, right? You invite people who you think can simulate what the North Koreans might be likely to do, but you don't invite the North Koreans for pretty obvious reasons. So, it wasn't designed to be the audience for this was not designed to be Donald Trump. The audience was designed to be people concerned about Trump's potential to break norms that we consider important.
And then a number of students have asked, does engaging in this exercise and talking a lot about it prime the pump and run the risk of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we really wrestled with that because I think it's a tightrope, I think we really wrestled with the issue of, if you're too alarmist, right? If you're like, oh my God, the sky is going to fall. Look, Trump's going to be a dictator. He's going to seize power. He's going to send the military into the streets. It's going to be terrible. There's a real danger. There are couple of dangers there. One is that a lot of people just get scared and depressed and they kind of go hide under their beds and they don't vote and they don't do anything because they're like fatalistic and they're like, the sky is falling. There's nothing I can do. I guess I'll go hide under my bed. Another danger is they go, oh my God, if the right-wing militias are getting their AR-15s, I better go buy my AR-15, and that you actually risk really destructive, vigilante type violence on the left. If you're warning about potential vigilante violence on the right. I think that's danger. The equal and opposite danger on the other side, and this is why I say it's a tightrope, if you don't talk honestly about risks, then you can't prepare to mitigate those risks. You can't do anything to prevent the risks. If you're not willing to say, hey, folks, here's a real danger, then there may be things you could do to prevent all those bad things from ever happening. And that's, that was the ultimate goal of these exercises, right? It was not to just make everybody have nightmares. It was not to make everybody go, oh my God, I'm scared. This is terrible. Bad things are going to happen. Oh shit. Oops, I'm not supposed to say that on family television. So beep.
We're going to be fined.
Thank you. The goal of these exercises was to identify potential risks and identify ways to mitigate those risks and this was back in June, between them in the election. So the ultimate goal is not to be able to say, on December 10th, see, we told you everything would go to hell. The goal of these exercises was to identify risks in a manner that would motivate people to do the things to mitigate those risks, so that in December we could say, great job, everybody. We thought about those risks. We did the things that would mitigate those risks. And so those scary scenarios that these exercises ended up with didn't happen. Hooray, good job, everybody. So that's the balance, is sort of you don't want to be too alarmist, but on the other hand, forewarned is forearmed, and nobody's going to do anything if they're all, if everybody is sitting around saying that will never happen, the military will never let it happen, then you're not going to actually think through the steps that you might need to take to mitigate the risk. And to give some very concrete examples, I mean, it was a tightrope, but it's one that we struggled with all through. But I think the fact that Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has repeatedly now made statements saying the US military does not belong in election situations. It would be a bad thing for the Insurrection Act to be invoked and to have active duty troops in American streets. The US military has no role in deciding the outcome of the election. That kind of statement is really important, and when President Trump, when pressed, refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power, and that forced others, including many GOP leaders, were put on the spot and were told, well, how about you? Do you agree with that? And the vast majority of them said, of course there will be a peaceful transfer of power if President Trump loses. Of course there will. I am absolutely committed to that. And when you push people and say things like, hey, President Trump is saying that all the mail-in ballots are fraudulent, he's not giving any evidence, but he seems to be suggesting that they shouldn't count. Do you agree with that? Or do you believe that every ballot should be counted? And yeah, of course, there are going to be some that are going to get thrown out because people mess up. They put the signature in the wrong place, or some bozo will try to vote twice or whatever. In every election, there's some tiny percentage of ballots that gets invalidated or thrown out for one reason. That'll happen. That's fine. But, when you say to GOP leaders, are you committed to making sure that every valid ballot is counted, whether they're votes cast in person or mailed in? And they say, yes, I am. That helps make a difference. That helps make the difference between whether we have a fiasco or whether we have an orderly vote count and whoever wins fair, and we have a free, fair, and peaceful election in which the winner is accepted as legitimate. So I do think that, difficult as that tightrope has been to walk, I do feel strongly that it was really important to highlight those risks so that people and institutions could be pushed to take the steps, do the training, make the statements, do the planning, do the research to make sure that this election is free, fair, and peaceful. And I'm actually much more optimistic about that now than I was a few months ago.
And that's because of the chair of the Joint Chiefs statement. It's because of Republican leaders saying that they will respect the result of the election and that all votes have to be counted. Are those examples? Are there other things that you think have been achieved?
I mean, those are just some of the examples. I mean, I think it's also, just to give a few other examples, I think it's at every level, from the elite level to the grassroots level. One of the points that we were making very early on that I think is now very widely accepted, and I don't mean to say that like we get credit for saying this. I mean, I think there were plenty of others who are trying to make this point too, but it was one that was very important for us to put out, was say there may not be a result on election night. And that's not because there's some shenanigans going on. It's because we're in the middle of a pandemic and millions of Americans are going to vote by mail because they're scared to go to a polling place because they don't want to get sick and risk dying. And so we have gotten used in the last 30, 40 years, and this is a new thing, right? For most of American history, you didn't have a result on election day because communications and transportation technologies meant that, counting those votes and getting the results communicated just took more time, took days or weeks. We, in recent decades, have gotten used to this idea that you stay up until 2 a.m. and you know who won. And that's probably not going to happen this year. It might. It is entirely possible that one or the other candidate will have so many votes from the in-person votes cast and counted on election day that even however many million outstanding provisional and mail-in ballots, if every single one of them went to the candidate who had fewer votes. It couldn't change the outcome. But the odds seem very, very high, given what we know from polls. The odds seem very, very high that we probably won't know who won at 3 or 4 in the morning on election day, and that we probably won't know for at least a few more days as those mail-in ballots get counted. Some states, such as Florida, start counting mail-in ballots as they come in. Other states, and this is a state law issue, and this is one of those election law things I didn't know anything about a year ago, and now I know more about than I wish I did. There are other states that prohibit mail-in ballots from being counted until election day. And so if you're in one of those states and suddenly you have 10 million mail-in ballots and you can't start counting them until election day, boy, it's going to take a while. And so one of the messages we were trying to get across was to the media, as well as to ordinary people, but partly to the ordinary people through the media, was there's no funny business going on if we don't know who won yet. And if somebody declares victory, if somebody says at 2 in the morning on election day, I won, look, the in-person votes favor me, that unless you can demonstrate that the outstanding mail-in ballots, even if every single one of them went to the other guy, it's not enough to change it. We don't have a winner yet. We're not done. We're still counting. And we don't declare a victor until we've counted the votes. And that's really important, because it's very easy to imagine a scenario, in which hypothetically say, the expectation, in part because the pandemic has become so politicized, which is a whole other topic and just makes me crazy. It's been politicized and distorted on both the right and the left. But what that means, among other things, is it looks like Democrats are much more likely to use mail-in ballots than Republicans. So it's entirely possible that at 2 in the morning on election night, the in-person ballots that have been counted favor Trump. And he'll say, I won. I'm still president for another 4 years. Hooray. And it's going to be really important for the networks not to say, oh, good, Trump won, the end, it's over. It's going to be really important for US allies and partners, other countries, not to say, oh, we're calling President Trump to congratulate him another 4 years. If we get that scenario, we really wanted to communicate to people, no, we wait and we make sure that every valid vote is counted before we make a decision about who won. So that was one of the things that we were wanting to get across. And a piece of that was states need poll workers. Those ballots don't count themselves. Especially the mail-in ballots, that they literally, somebody's got to open that envelope. They've got to compare the signatures. They got it, it's work. It just takes time. And if you don't have enough people, especially during a pandemic, and typically it's older people, it's retired people who often are the poll worker volunteers. And they're the people who are most vulnerable to COVID. They're the people who are most likely to kind of go, oh, maybe that's not such a hot idea this year. So on the grassroots level, we were saying people need to volunteer to be poll workers. States need people to count those ballots, et cetera, et cetera. So whether you want to talk about that grassroots level, or whether you want to talk about saying, hey, you know what, if you are a military leader, or you are the head of the FBI, or you are a police leader, it's really important that you articulate the value of nonpartisanship. It's really important that you be pushing training down through the ranks so that every police officer, every National Guardsman, et cetera, understands the do's and don'ts during an election season, understands how to police a civilian crowd exercising First Amendment rights. All of those things have to happen. And I actually do. I'm not going to say I'm confident that everything is going to be fine, but I will say that I actually feel more optimistic that enough of those things have now happened that I feel more confident that things probably will be okay in terms of the election, whether we have a result at 4 in the morning. Or whether we don't have a result until a week later.
So a couple of technical questions. One of the things that,
Don't get too technical. Remember, I'm not an election lawyer.
yeah, but one of the things that was a takeaway for me in reading the materials was just, that a lot of both parts of the Constitution and the legislation wasn't drafted in ways that dealt with all the situations that we may conceivably confront. So one question is, in Bush versus Gore, the court said that states can, quote, take back the power to appoint electors. Is that a possibility that, we should be concerned about? Is it possible that some legislatures will say, we can't rely on the popular vote. We're going to choose who the electors are.
Yeah, it's a possibility. And going from my guarded optimism to the doom and gloom scenarios, yeah, there are some very scary scenarios. And so here's one of them, right? Is that we get a swing state. In several of the swing states, we have a divided government. We have a Democratic governor and a Republican state legislature. Imagine we get a situation where the late breaking mail-in ballots are for Biden and Democratic candidate, whereas the election day ballots favor Trump, and the Trump campaign successfully persuades the Republican, and let's say that the ballots, when counted, favor Biden when you add in those mail-in ballots. And so the Democratic governor says, okay, our slate of electors is going to be pledged to Biden, and off they're going to go to Washington, and that's that. Biden has won this state. But then meanwhile, the Republican legislature says, we think those mail-in ballots were fake. We think they're all messed up, and maybe this is pursuant to litigation. Maybe it's not. They're all, you can, in my choose your own adventure, you could have any number of permutations of how this could play out. And you've got Breitbart and Fox News and more extremist websites that are making all kinds of claims about, 7,000 ballots for Biden were cast by one dead guy and whatever. And so the Republican legislature says, we don't think that popular vote count can be trusted. We think the real will of the people here in the state was to vote for Trump. And so we are going to send a slate of electors to Congress pledged to Trump. And then you get two slates of electors, one sent by the governor, one sent by the legislature, one pledged to Biden, one pledged to Trump. And our election law, my colleague Ned Foley, an election law expert at Ohio State, who was one of the our experts in our scenarios when we had these technical problems, he kind of goes, you know what? We don't actually, the law does not provide a clear answer. And there are more branching pathways that range from scenarios where Mike Pence is the tiebreaker, all the way to Nancy Pelosi refuses to convene a joint session of Congress, so nobody shows up and Nancy Pelosi becomes president. You've got all kinds of crazy stuff that could happen. I hope and pray it doesn't happen. But yeah, this is another, going back to laws and norms, the laws don't really give us clear answers. And go, Bill, you mentioned Bush v. Gore in 2000. That ended not because the law ended it. The Supreme Court stopped the counting, but Gore, as the vice president, could have gone to Congress and said, okay, Congress, the Constitution seems to give you the power to decide. And oh, by the way, I get to cast the deciding vote because I am, I'm the head of the Senate as the vice president. And Gore chose not to do that, right? He chose not to do that because back in the quaint old days of 2000, he basically said, I think it's better for the stability of the country that this not turn into a political battle. I'm not going to go there. I'm gonna let it rest. The end. And he did. And that was a decision. That was the equivalent of the decision to stop at a stoplight when no police cars were around and he didn't have to, but he did it anyway, you know. And I don't think we have politicians right now on either side who feel inclined to do that. So again, you know, the optimistic scenarios is it just doesn't get to that. You know, the it's clear enough. There are enough political leaders on both the Democratic and the GOP side who say, hey, look, here's what the vote was. Everybody's just got to deal with it. That we don't get into any of those messy scenarios. But I do think there remains a risk. I can't quantify it. You know, is it 1 in 2? Is it 1 in 1,000? I don't know. But there certainly does remain a risk that we could end up with a real constitutional impasse. And, you know, the really nightmarish scenario is not only do you have the constitutional impasse at an elite level, but, you know, just as we saw massive racial justice protests over the last, you know, 6 to 8 months, triggered at first by the killing of George Floyd. And then we saw counter protest and armed counter protesters and white nationalist militias and Antifa and, you know, Lafayette Square and Trump federalizing the guard and threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act. You could imagine a constitutional impasse that is accompanied by street level chaos, at that level times 100. And certainly possible to imagine really, really bad things happening.
So now let's, you know, I think you've kind of, you know, highlighted both the reasons for optimism, which I think is, you know, in part because of the work that you've done, but, you know, also the open issues in terms of kind of the law. So let's talk about that for a few minutes. So what structural changes would you like to see implemented before the 2024 election to try and stop this rather daunting process from occurring again?
Boy, you know, I think it's, you know, again, it's law and it's norms, right? That you can write down whatever you want to write down in the law, but you have to have political parties and a citizenry that is committed to it. And I'm not going to give you a good answer here again, because I'm not an election expert, but it does seem glaringly obvious, even to a non-expert, that the lack of clarity provided by both the Constitution itself and the subsequent laws that attempt the 12th Amendment and the subsequent laws that attempt to clarify this, that it would be nice to have laws that actually give some more definitive answers about who ends up being the decider, you know, or in what circumstances do you hold a new election. And even small things like the fact Marco Rubio, who's Republican, had put legislation out. Right now, states have a deadline. I can't remember what it is. I think it's December 14th, by which they have to have counted all their votes and come up with their slates of electors. It's quite possible that because of the pandemic and the sheer quantity of mail-in ballots, that there will be states that can't meet that deadline, which would cause a whole other crisis. And Rubio has a bill saying, why don't we extend that? You know, this is kind of dumb. You know, this is completely arbitrary. Why don't we just say, you know, I can't remember what the details of his bill are, but it's a good bill. You know, it's a bill that says we wouldn't want the will of the people to be thwarted just because for technical reasons a state couldn't get those mail-in ballots counted in time. You know, so things like that seem like no-brainers. You know, trying to sort of make sure we have technical fixes. I also think, you know, we're a federalist system, which has all kinds of benefits. It's also got all kinds of problems because we have very, very wide variations in how states count ballots and so on. And as I mentioned earlier, for instance, you know, some states start counting mail-in ballots as they arrive. Other states don't count them until election day. Seems to me it would be a very sensible rule change to say that all states can start counting them as they arrive, because they're not processed in, again, it literally varies from precinct to precinct, but most states have some electronic means of doing at least the initial count of the in-person ballot. You know, you stick here in Virginia, for instance, where I vote in Alexandria, you stick your ballot into a scanning machine and it instantly records the results. You don't have to have two people poring over it with a magnifying glass. You've got the paper backup in case there's a dispute. Some states don't even have paper backups. That would be another good reform. Make sure everybody does have paper backups. But because the mail-in ballots do require the people with the magnifying glasses comparing the signatures, and some states require witnesses and some don't, some sort of legislation backed by incentives. And I think there are constitutional ways that you could do this that create a more harmonized national system for how we do voting and counting voting would help a whole lot in terms of reducing just the combination of sheer confusion and the opportunities for bad faith actors to litigate for no good reason, but just to sort of throw wrenches into the spokes.
So another question about kind of what we do moving forward. How can we inoculate and strengthen domestic resilience against foreign and domestic disinformation?
Boy, that's a really hard one. That's a really, really hard one. And I think that's actually one of the biggest dangers we face. And it's one that's not going to go away no matter what happens with this election. I think even if this election goes like a dream, right? And we have a result, in a few days, and everybody's like, oh yeah, look, Trump won. Oh, look, Biden won. Everybody's like, got it, fine. Lots of people will be unhappy if their candidate doesn't win. But let's say we get a result where nobody's like, oh, that wasn't fair. That was a coup. But everybody's like, yeah, this candidate won. I think even if that happens, we do face the work of a generation, not the work of a presidential administration, trying to figure out what to do about disinformation and the fact that increasingly Americans inhabit sort of information bubbles that don't even intersect anymore. And when you think about something like the rise of QAnon conspiracies, I had never even heard of QAnon until, I don't know, sometime within the last year, certainly. And for any of you listeners who haven't heard of it, it's a conspiracy theory that started in, Reddit and 4chan and 8chan, where somebody purporting to be the holder of a high-level security clearance at the Energy Department started posting random things in which he suggested that there was a vast conspiracy in which Democratic elected officials are running a child sex trafficking ring, and there's some stuff about shape-shifting aliens and celebrities who control. It doesn't make any sense. It's crazy. I can't even describe it. It's nuts. And at first, it was this completely fringe thing of, there's always somebody who believes something crazy. There are people who think the earth is flat. There are people who think that CIA is controlling their minds and they have to wear tinfoil hats and so forth. But it has somehow become increasingly dominant and kind of seeped into the mainstream media. We saw a couple of years ago that somebody actually acted on it. And one of the many bizarre pieces of this conspiracy was the notion that Hillary Clinton and John Podesta were running a child sex trafficking ring out of the back room of Comet Ping Pong, which, as many of you know, is a pizza place on Connecticut Avenue. And a guy picked up his gun and decided he better go to Comet Ping Pong and, liberate the child sex slaves from the back room. And he showed up in Comet Ping Pong with his weapon and he fired to the ceiling to scare anybody. And thank God the police arrived and arrested him before he could hurt anybody. But, there are people who act on these crazy stuff. And at this point, I actually think it's less important whether it's foreign disinformation, and clearly there is evidence that some of this stuff was so deliberately by foreign actors, in particular Russia. But I think it actually matters less whether it's foreign disinformation. It's just that it's disinformation and it creates its own reality. I mean, another piece of what the Russians were doing and the Russian goal seemed to have both been to help Trump, but also, frankly, to just sow chaos and distrust in American democracy and norms. And so one of the things that Russian actors did, for instance, was create fake Black Lives Matter pages on Facebook and so on, saying things like, there's going to be a Black Lives rally on such and such a date at such and such a time and place, kill all the pigs. And this wasn't actually Black Lives Matter. This was completely fake. But, you're always going to have some crazy people in any group. And so you're going to have some crazy people who are like, yeah, okay, Black Lives Matter, kill the pigs, I'm going to show up. And then they show up and they talk to each other. And suddenly you have a group of people who say, hey, we're Americans, we are Black Lives Matter, and we want to kill the pigs. And you do that enough, and it creates its own reality. And we saw that on the far right. We saw that there were doxing attempts. There was a guy who was actually seemed to have been a leftist, seemed to have been a Bernie supporter, who thought it would be really funny to post social media rumors saying that Antifa was going to be burning American flags at Gettysburg, and so that all militia groups should show up and prevent this sacrilege from occurring. And this was completely fake. There was no such thing as an Antifa plan to burn flags at Gettysburg, but enough white nationalist militia groups believed it that hundreds of armed people showed up at Gettysburg to prevent this non-existent thing. Again, nothing happened. The police were there and sort of said, there's nothing going on here, go home, guys. But the degree to which disinformation, straight out lies can manipulate people and then create their own reality, because then just as you suddenly have a bunch of people who are saying, I'm in Black Lives Matter and this is what we believe in, even though everybody else in Black Lives Matter is like, what? That's not what we believe in. That suddenly then you got a bunch of guys who are they're like, we need to defeat Antifa wherever they are. And now we're all connected to each other. We can all talk to each other. That scares me enormously. And I don't have, again, here's another, Bill, you're asking me a whole bunch of questions to which I don't have a good answer. I think, I don't know if you're going to be talking in this program to Mary McCord, who's one of our visiting professors and who tracks violent extremist homegrown groups in the US. But I think the combination of disinformation and violent extremist organizations in the US, we've seen a sort of exponential growth of both of those, and they're not going anywhere after this election, no matter who wins. It's going to be an enormous challenge. And I think part of the solution to that lies with better and different regulation of social media, which has done an extraordinarily poor job of monitoring and stamping out overt lies and false information and conspiracy theories that spread like wildfire on Reddit, on Facebook in particular, et cetera. And part of it, again, it's the work, that's that 47 years or whatever to fix the rule of law. It doesn't happen overnight. It's that kind of slow person to person, effort. And I don't know a good answer for you. I wish I did.
So let me just kind of draw back from the Integrity Project. We talk about leadership, which I think is, particularly as we're focusing on how you restore norms. The question is kind of what can anyone do? How do we affect change? And one of the things that's remarkable and very unusual about your career is kind of the multifaceted dimension of what you've done.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Dog, by the way. Well,
what's that?
My dog is attempting to join the conversation to buy.
You've had leadership roles in government, waving to your dog.
Okay.
You've had leadership role in government. You've also been really, very much a public intellectual. You've written for the LA Times, the Atlantic, Foreign Policy. For our students, as they're thinking about their careers, what do you think is most important to make change in these roles? Do you have any kind of advice on, what you're trying to do and what you feel like you've been successful in doing?
Um, I guess, I mean, I guess several pieces of advice. One, and I'm sure that your students have heard this from everyone. Most careers are not linear. Um, you know, most interesting careers, you don't plan them at the beginning. Things just happen. Doors open and you think, what the heck? I think I'll go through that door, and you see what happens. And then some other door opens, and you end up in a place that you didn't expect. And sort of to be willing to be open to doing that. I think law students in particular tend to fall prey to this. I have to have everything planned out. First I'm gonna take these classes, I'm gonna clerk, I'm going to work for a big firm for 3 years and pay down my loans, and I'm going to go do this, and I'm going to go do that, then I'm going to go, and then in 25 years I'm going to be a judge or whatever it may be. And some people do that, and more power to them, and they're happy. But I think that being willing to be open to serendipity, and being willing to take some risks, and being willing to say, not think about things in terms of, do I want to do X or Y for my career, but to be willing to think of it in terms of, will this be interesting for the next year or so? Because if the answer is, this sounds like it could be kind of interesting for the next year or so, I have no idea where it's going to lead. It's going to lead to something else that will be interesting for another year or so, which will lead to something else that will be interesting for another year or so. And you may have no idea at the beginning where you'll be in 10 years, but you've got a pretty good guarantee that in 10 years, you'll spend 10 years doing things that were interesting to you. Whereas if instead you're like, well, my 10-year plan is I have to do A, B, C, D, and E, you may or may not like it. You may or not actually get where you want to go. And even if you get there, you may have spent 10 years doing stuff you didn't really like. So it's just to be open to serendipity, open to taking risks. And I guess another piece of that is that not everybody's going to like you all the time. You have to be willing. And I think, this is also a sort of law student disease. I mean, those of us who go to law school, we're often very risk averse. We go to law school because we're not quite sure what else to do, but we want to be respectable, and we don't want to be poor, and we don't want our families to be like, what a ne'er-do-well, but you have to be willing to say things that will make people mad, including your friends. And one of the questions you asked me earlier, Bill, was a question about, would we have done this transition integrity project stuff, if Trump had been a Democrat? And when I got out of the Obama administration, when I left the Defense Department, I started writing a weekly column for Foreign Policy. And I wrote a number of columns that were very critical of the Obama administration. And I thought they were fair. I wouldn't have written them if I didn't think they were valid criticisms. And my people got really mad at me, and were like, you're being disloyal, you can't say those things. And it was sort of painful. It was painful because I thought, I'm saying things that are true. They're true. You're my friends. Why are you being mean to me? And I also sort of had to say to them, what, my job is not to defend the Obama administration. My job, as I see it, is to tell the truth as I understand it. It might, and that's what I see my job as. And that means sometimes I'm going to make people mad. And sometimes I'm going to make people mad who I like, and I don't want to have to be mad at me. And that's no fun. It's very painful, but you get through it. That you have to just be willing to do that. And you have to be willing to take flack. And I was telling this story to you and to Professor Sale when we were talking the other day. One of my early painful experiences is almost 20 years ago, when I was, my early 30s. I was teaching at UVA, and I was on the board of Amnesty International USA, and it's kind of a big deal. I was really excited. I was pretty early in my career, and there was a big internal fight on the Amnesty board, which I won't bore any of you with the details, but but it sort of exploded into the press. There were, articles about it in the Times, the New Yorker, and I and several other board members ended up resigning in protest over a position the rest of the board had voted to take. And I was perfectly fine with having, Guatemalan thugs denounce me, but other people who I thought were sort of on my side were mad at me too. And it was very painful. And, people were, that's, nasty accusations were flying around. And I called my father up, and, I was maybe 31, 32 at the time. And I was expecting my dad to say, "Oh, you poor thing, people shouldn't be mean to you," because usually that's what my dad says, that's what dads are supposed to say. And I think I caught my dad in an off moment. And I was like, "Dad, look, this terrible thing is happening and people are being mean to me because of these positions I've taken." And he said, a little impatiently, he said, "Look, you decided to play with the big kids. You're Amnesty International is a internationally known organization, and you decided that you were going to get in the middle of a controversial issue that was going to get national attention. And when you do that, there are going to be people who don't like you. There are going to be people who are going to be mean to you. There are going to be people who are unfair to you. And if you don't like the heat, get out of the kitchen. If you want to get involved in issues that matter, suck it up." And I was really kind of hurt. I was like, boo-hoo, you're supposed to be saying, "How dare those people be mean to my darling daughter?" And I think if I'd caught him in a different day, he probably would have said things like that. But I really, it was actually an important lesson for me that I took away. And I think about it often. I think about it all the time whenever something happens where I take a stand and, somebody criticizes me in some way that feels hurtful or unfair. I remind myself, if you're going to be out there, if you're going to try to engage with issues of importance in the public world, people are going to throw mud at you. And some of it will be totally unfair. Some of it may actually be fair. And you actually have to be willing both to deal with the unfair stuff and grapple with the parts that may be fair and rethink your own positions and be willing to do that. And that's hard and that's painful, but it's sort of something that you've got to do, I guess.
I mean, it's striking. I think one thing that I've read is that the way we experience criticism, that essentially one critical statement is more powerful than 10 positive statements. And you really have demonstrated courage repeatedly in your career, and that brings attack with it, which is hard to take. So I think kind of your reflections, that you just, in some sense, it's something that you have to embrace and accept, but it's not easy.
No, that's right. And that's absolutely true. That I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine. I was talking to Susan Glasser, who's a college classmate of mine, who now writes for the New Yorker, as former executive editor of the Washington Post. And we were talking about, she had just published a book and I had recently published a book. And we were talking about the one line in the one review for each of us that we thought was really unfair. And we both were very lucky. We both had gotten fantastic reviews overall, and yet both Susan and I could recite word for word, like the one sentence in the one review that we were like, "And then this reviewer said blah 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 blah, and that's so unfair." And we were just laughing at each other. We were like, to our dying day, we will remember this one sentence. And despite the fact that there were, 100 other sentences that were like, "What a great book," we were fixated. It's so hard not to fixate on that one thing. I think it's human nature. But I see there was a related question in the Q&A that popped up about What do you do when, oops, it disappeared? It was there, but
Yeah, actually, let me read it because I saved it.
I
Uh,
see that.
and why don't we close with it? But again, I think
Yeah,
you're talking about dealing with criticism and
yeah,
accepting it and realizing it's inevitable. I think that's very powerful. So the question is, one second, let me get it on my screen. What lessons have you learned? And this will be our final question. What lessons have you learned from working with people who disagree with you? How do you balance being true to yourself with hearing others' perspectives?
yeah. No, it's really hard. But another thing that my father said to me many years ago, uh, when I went to college, he gave me a nice card when I went off to college, and it had some of his favorite quotes. And I remember almost all of them. One of them was James Thurber's quote of it's better to know some of the questions than all of the answers. But one of the other quotes, and I can't remember who it was from, was something to the effect of, whenever you hear someone or read someone say something that you're instantly react to by thinking like, that's completely wrong, that's outrageously stupid and wrong, before you respond, do the thought experiment of thinking, what would it take for an intelligent person of good faith to believe this? What epistemological universe would you have to live in for this view to make sense? And wait until you can articulate that to yourself before you try to respond to that person. Um, um, that you have to be willing to try to get in, and I think about this even with these extremist right-wing militias. I was sort of reading some interviews with right-wing militia members talking about their perceptions of how their freedoms are being jeopardized by federal government action and so on. And you have to understand that I think you have to be willing to. I think that there are cynical, ruthless, and evil people in the world. By the way, I don't think that everybody's just a nice, misinformed person. I think there really are ruthless and cynical and evil people in the world. I won't name names, but there are some. But I also think that the vast majority of people, including the vast majority of people with whom I passionately disagree and who I think are doing dangerous, destructive things, are decent people acting in good faith, but who are operating from a sort of a different set of, it goes back to the disinformation question. I may think that they're misinformed. I may think that they're wrong about things, but I think it's really important to take seriously the idea that most people are acting in good faith, and that when someone disagrees with you, to try to have more curiosity, less judgment, and be willing to kind of say, instead of just getting defensive or getting angry or getting offended, whatever the issue is, to be willing to say, I have a really different perspective. Here's where my perspective comes from. Can you talk to me about where does your perspective come from? Because sometimes, I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish and say, and then you'll all be friends and there will be rainbows and unicorns. But just, that sometimes you find that there is actually more area of agreement. And maybe this is to end on a slightly optimistic note, going back to that disinformation question, and what do we do with this legacy of anger and divisiveness that will be with us no matter what happens in this election. I do think that we could all do with a little bit more of a spirit of, we actually do all have a lot in common, and let's try to find those common elements. Let's try to figure out what beliefs then lead us off in different directions, and what we can do about that. I think one thing we do know from social psychology is that confirmation bias is very, very powerful. We tend to look for things that confirm our pre-existing views, and depressingly, all the social science experiments where people are given factual information that contradicts some belief they have, and rather than making them go, oh, maybe I was wrong, they just double down. They double down on whatever it is, even if it is in fact factually wrong. so trying, trying to approach things a little bit more through the heart and through storytelling and through trying to understand values, I think is often much more effective than just pummeling people with the facts, or, how dare you say that, you must hate women, or you must hate minorities, or you must hate the rule of law, and instead saying, okay, tell me what you're worried about. Tell me what your experience has been. Let's try to talk about this. Let me tell you what I'm worried about. And it doesn't always work, because as I said, there are evil, cynical, ruthless people in the world. But I think there are also a lot of good people in the world. So that does give me hope that sometimes those and this is, I know we're almost out of time, but one of the things that, as you know, Bill, we run through the Innovative Policing Program here, a fellowship program for young DC police officers. And we also run a practicum course. I'm not teaching it this semester, but Professor Lopez and I have co-taught it together for most semesters in the last 3 years. And we often end up having law students and young police officers talking together. And they come in thinking, I'm going to hate this person. We are, diametrically opposed views. And one of the things that I think as a teacher is just most amazing and inspiring is how often they walk out and they say to us, that was an amazing conversation. I had no idea that we were worried about so many of the same things, and we still disagree about X and Y, but I had no idea that that person was grappling with this too. And so, so I think that those conversations, it's slow, it's painful, it's not, snap your fingers and everything is fixed, but that kind of conversation can make a really powerful difference.
That's really a remarkable way to end. I think that, this has been a great conversation about, the project, the Transparency Project and your work now, but using it to think, more broadly about how we make change, how we learn, how we experience disappointment, and about the importance of dialogue. So in a course on lawyers as leaders, that's really, each of those is such a powerful lesson. So, thank you for all you're doing, and thank you for this conversation. So
thank you very much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
very good. And we will see you all next week, everyone. So take care and stay well. And again, thank you very much, Professor Rosa Brooks.